Hello, good morning, assalamu alaikum to all my Muslim viewers, and good greetings to all the viewers from all over the world. Today, we are going to discuss enlightenment. Enlightenment is a philosophical movement which emerged in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And enlightenment was the purpose of enlightenment was that people could think with reason instead of just following the cultural norms that they were following for centuries. It was the philosophers who were involved in the movement of enlightenment, who were at the forefront of enlightenment. They used to advocate for people to not just follow what they were being dictated by religious authorities or state authorities or their leaders or their heads, their tribal heads. So enlightenment meant that people need to think with reasoning. They need to argue, and they should think that if that whatever they are doing, is it right or wrong, and they should use their own wisdom, they should use their own intelligence, they should think with their own mind, with their own observation, they should learn, they should think. This is what defines enlightenment. And as we can see that Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, was at the forefront of this movement. He wrote a very famous essay in 1784. It was a German essay which was translated into English language, and uh, it was titled "What is Enlightenment?" So I have an interest in discussing enlightenment, and I have been trying to do it on this show for the past 4 years, because I was working in a publication where we used to publish Western ideologies. So enlightenment was one of them, and I was trying to do it in my own Urdu language. But now today I have got the opportunity, thanks to Mr. John B. Kofus, that now we are going to discuss it in English language. So we are going to discuss. I have already presented you a brief definition of enlightenment, and Mr. John B. Kofus is going to go into the details of the history of enlightenment and how enlightenment impacted the religious, social, or cultural, or political atmosphere in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how can we see the long-lasting effects of enlightenment in today's world. So now I have given a brief introduction, and now Mr. John Bukofis is going to explain it. And I'm very thankful that he's discussing a topic he has worked very hard, he has researched very hard, and now he is prepared to discuss on it. And he just he accepted my request that we should discuss enlightenment. I'm very thankful to him. Now let's proceed to Mr. John B. Kofis. How are you, sir?
Good morning, Assad. Good morning, everyone.
Good
I'm
morning.
fine, thank you. Yes, this is a very, very important topic, and Immanuel Kant is one of the towering philosophers of Western civilization. He influenced all philosophers coming after him, including thinkers in his own age. You are correct indeed that in his publication, What is Enlightenment? It's one of the few publications that addresses it holistically provides an overview of the Enlightenment. The fact is that Immanuel Kant is someone about whom enormous literature has been devoted to. Thinkers from all over the world have written about Immanuel Kant. I first studied him as an undergraduate. I was a double major, philosophy and history, before I veered off to international political economy. I really did not appreciate and understand him nearly as much when I studied him in a philosophy course. I studied his metaphysics and his ethics, especially his best known work, Critique of Pure Reason. Um, I really began to understand him a lot more when I studied him him in the context of his environment. Immanuel Kant, as you pointed out, is an 18th century thinker. He was born in Prussia. Prussia was one of the 36 Germanic states. It was under the sponsorship of Prussia that finally Germany was unified by a Prussian diplomat, Otto von Bismarck, in 1870. So he came from the leading Germanic state of Prussia. Prussia, just to give the everyone, the audience, an understanding of what Prussia was like in the 18th as well as the 19th century when Bismarck unified it. Prussia was a very conservative, religiously Lutheran, by the way. Immanuel Kant was a Lutheran, although he had his disagreements with the theologian Martin Luther of the Reformation era. But he was a Lutheran. He grew up Lutheran. He was influenced by Luther criticisms and reservations about some of Luther's theology. Aside, he was influenced by Luther. Prussia was a militaristic state, the most militaristic in Central Europe, and it was part of a. It was influenced also by a king, Frederick the Great, with whom Kant, by the way, had a close association. He was advisor to the king. Kant was by profession, by the way, before I go further, a mathematician and a philosopher. And he came from the middle class. And according to some 19th century philosophers who took an interest in him, he was in fact a representative of the rising middle class in Prussia. Now, that's, I'll get more in detail into him. I want to go back to what you mentioned about the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment came in the 18th century. The 18th century coincided with two major, the 18th century was the century of two major revolutions, I should say, not coincided. Two major revolutions coincided in the 18th century. One was the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason because of the emphasis on rationality and the assumption in the 18th century that reason was the catalyst to human happiness and to human advancement and human progress at the individual level, but also the collective level. In other words, applying reason through science. By the way, reason had a specific meaning, and we'll get more into how the scientific revolution influenced the age of the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution came in the 17th century, and major intellectuals like Sir Isaac Newton, for example, the physicist and mathematician, influenced the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. In the case of philosophers, René Descartes, the French philosopher, also mathematician, influencing the emphasis, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, the emphasis on reason. The idea was that reason was the key to solving problems in society, institutional problems. Now, why is it called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, as opposed to what took before? What was it that took place before that? Well, in Europe, the fact is that for more than 1,000 years, the Middle Ages is also called the Age of Faith. The dominant institution was Christianity, and the worldview of people, including intellectuals, who invariably came out of the background of the church, was influenced by the teachings of theology, Christian theology. So the age of reason is to be contrasted with the age of faith. And they believed, especially after the scientific revolution of the 17th century, that science, which uses reason, not faith, is the key to understanding the universe, whether it's in the domain of astronomy, gravity, for example, like Newton focused on, or to solve other institutional problems, in practical problems in society. Everything from criminal justice, by the way. There was a major Enlightenment thinker of Italian background in this case, Cesare Beccaria, who argued that the age of faith prevented people, especially governments, in understanding the criminal justice system and the criminal mind, and that the way to address the criminal justice system was not with religious assumptions, but rather with scientific. For example, why is it that some people commit crimes? What is it about the human being that drives that person to commit crimes? Cesare Beccaria revolutionized the domain of the criminal justice system, and the approach to legal issues, how the court should deal with criminals, how the prison system should deal with criminals. The assumption was that they were evil and must be punished. And Cesare Beccaria comes along and says, well, either that they have psychological problems so they commit crimes, or they are driven to crime because of poverty, because of conditions surrounding the whole condition of poverty. And the way to rehabilitate is not to punish, but to help them reintegrate into the societal mainstream. This is an example of a rationalist approach. Immanuel Kant was influenced by all of this. He was also influenced by Isaac Newton, obviously, and like I said, he was a mathematician and a philosopher. But he was also influenced by John Locke, the father of liberalism in Western civilization, who, by the way, lived in the 17th century. He lived in the age of science, during the scientific revolution. He did not live in the 18th century. He lived in Isaac Newton, René Descartes, and John Locke. Those three that I mentioned already are called precursors to the Enlightenment. In other words, they came before, but influenced forward. And Kant was no different than anyone else in his time. Now, he was brilliant, by the way. Somewhat difficult to understand when I was studying him. I didn't think he was as difficult as some other thinkers that came out of the philosophical tradition of Germany, but including, Hegel and Martin Heidegger during the interwar period, or Ludwig Wittgenstein in the after him the post-war period. But he wasn't easy. I thought he was difficult. I really understood him a lot more. Like I said, when I put him into a historical context. Um, Immanuel Kant addressed a number of issues, and he was controversial. In fact, both his parents, as well as the king of Prussia, advised him not to criticize theology, not to criticize, especially Martin Luther, who obviously Lutheranism was the official religion, sect of Christianity, but Kant remained true to his. He did, by the way, stop criticizing publicly because Kant was a conformist. I want to make sure people understand this is because there's a lot of literature about Kant. And a lot of it contradicts. One contradicts the other if you look at it. He came out of a period where critical thinking was what one was supposed to do, especially a philosopher like him, obviously. So he did emphasize critical thinking. Critical thinking obviously means you're right back to the rationalism of the period, although in Critique of Pure Reason, he's critical of rationalism. Now, I want to also point out that the Enlightenment brought about a number of people who are called deists. That is, deism, it's a Latin term, dei, it refers to God. A lot of intellectuals in the 18th century, both in Europe, by the way, as well as in the United States, were very critical of the institution of the church, but they believed in God. They believed in God that was basically a God who created the universe and accepted the Newtonian physics assumption that the universe. Newton, by the way, himself was an Anglican. He was also religious. The Newtonian universe operates on its own laws. So the deists took the Newtonian physics element, applied it to a higher being, and argued that the God was sort of aloof. Now, Kant did not advocate deism. There were also a few atheists in the 18th century, as there were very few in the 17th century, more in the 19th, by the way. As we move forward with the age of materialism, you get more atheism, which stands to reason. Now, there are people who have argued that, there are very few, who have argued that Kant was an atheist or Kant was a deist. He was actually not. I guess you can stretch it and see aspects of his philosophy. Oh, well, that's suspect. But he was not. He on the other hand, he did reject the ontological argument for the existence of God, which René Descartes, a precursor to the Enlightenment, this is ontology. The word is Greek, by the way. It's an ancient Greek word, which just means existence. Basically, the idea that you can prove the existence of God through reason, which René Descartes tried to do, as well as others. Kant comes along and says, well, the fact is, you can't know God. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, divided all reality into two domains. What is empirically known, what we can know through the five senses. Basically, Locke's philosophy. Locke was an empiricist, by the way, the premier empiricist. Believed in empiricism. So his epistemology, another Greek word which means theory of knowledge, was based on empiricism. What we know of the world is through our senses, through our sensory perception, the five senses. Uh, then along come the rationalists and argue, well, we can also reason things out, obviously. Uh, through mathematics is the purest form of that. And like I said, René Descartes, who was a rationalist as well as Immanuel Kant, said uh, certainly rely on reason. Kant comes along and said, well, the two realities are the empiricist, and again, he used Germans, by the way, relied very heavily on classical Greek philosophy and very heavily on classical Greek terms. So he used Greek terms, classical Greek terms. The phenomena, which means what appears to us and what we can sense, that's one reality. And then there is another one, which is the essence of things, which is called noumena in classical Greek, which we can't know. And that's where he places the category. I'll give you two examples. The soul of human beings is in that category. We can't empirically know it. You can't sense it. You can't. Or God, he placed God in the same category. So his argument was, you can't possibly know God. He's in that other category, the nominal category. So ontological proof of the existence of God can be put forward. So he rejected that. However, uh, he argued that morality, he placed all emphasis on what is called the categorical imperative in Kantian thinking. The categorical imperative is, think of it, and I'm not going to get into technical stuff, but think of the Ten Commandments. Okay? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not do this thing. Kant did not, the categorical imperative are moral guides for human beings so that they can act in a moral way toward other human beings and toward society, so that they themselves are enhanced by this moral lifestyle and that they enhance society. He maintained that this categorical imperative, this moral path, if you will, is the proof we need. We don't need ontological proof that in fact should lead and does lead back to God. So he did not believe that you need to believe in God in order to be moral. Just the opposite, you should be moral and it leads you toward God. So this is the argument in very summary terms. Now, Immanuel Kant was a man who wanted the ultimate goal. He believed that human beings should be happy and should be moral, should do the right thing, and not harm other human beings, by the way. In fact, people out there who want to do more reading on this will find this out on their own. He argued that human beings should not use the other as a mean, but an end. And this, in other words, this is indicative that he believed very strongly that morality should be based on altruism, and that the categorical imperative is, which are universal moral rules. They don't apply to a single person, to me, let's say, or to somebody else, to you, or to just Prussians, but are universal. They're for the entire human race. Those are he believed the principles by which human beings should live and would lead to better life for the individual, better life for society. Here's the question, though. What is it that constitutes the dynamics of morality? How is morality shaped? And is morality determined socioeconomically, politically, and culturally? Is it some theological doctrine that is superimposed? And the question is, again, to what degree is the universality of morality a practical matter? Because he talked about practical morality, by the way, and theoretical issues as well. For example, someone starving to death, as the French intellectual Victor Hugo pointed out in the 19th century, in his fictional work, Jean Valjean, Les Miserables in French, will steal a loaf of bread to feed himself and his family. It's immoral. Thou shalt not steal, according to the Ten Commandments. However, the person is starving to death, and his children are starving, and his wife is just, they're all starving. His wife was actually dying. So, in other words, the question of morality is determined how. And is it moral to have, let's take Immanuel Kant's time, to have a upper clergy and a lower clergy and an aristocracy? By the way, in Prussia, the aristocracy, which dominated not just in Kant's time but through the 19th century, is called Junker, the Junker class. Otto von Bismarck came out of the class. Immanuel Kant did not belong to that; he belonged to the bourgeoisie. So in the 19th century, other philosophers said, well, he really reflected the morality of the bourgeoisie when he sort of synthesized reason and empiricism, rationalism and empiricism. The question that he never asked and should have asked in the 19th century about morality is, which goes to the heart of morality throughout the ages, regardless of where you are in the world, should morality be linked to social justice? And that question, he did not. He dealt also heavily on the individual's morality. Again, without looking at the fact that the individual who is starving to death in the streets and is homeless is very different than a Junker, an aristocrat in Prussia, who is at his palatial home and is enjoying all the goods of life. So morality becomes a luxury for someone who is on the street. Again, as Victor Hugo pointed out, in the 19th century. So Immanuel Kant's emphasis on morality really represented it was a continuation of the Lutheran tradition, which, by the way, Lutheranism differs as a Protestant sect of Christianity from Catholicism insofar as Catholicism takes into account the collective of the Christian community and salvation of the individual through the institution, the Catholic Church, whereas Lutheranism, salvation comes from the relationship of the individual with God. that particular element, that particular idea that I just mentioned, influenced Kant because to him, um, who, by the way, is described again, as if people want to read more on him, as a transcendental idealist. To him, as a transcendental idealist and a moral theist meaning theism, again, another Greek word which means God. Um, to him, salvation comes from morality, the moral path of the individual. Um, Scratching below the surface, again, the question is, do that's fine at the theoretical level, and this is why he's called an idealist, by the way, an idealist philosopher. Assuming all human beings, because these are universal maxims, right? All human beings across the entire planet are exactly the same in terms of social class and social conditions, but they're not. And so that is very important. This is not to deny anything he's posited, everything, anything he's put forward. It is simply to bring to light uh, elements in the 19th century that other theologians and philosophers, including one of the most brilliant German theologians, his name is Ludwig Feuerbach, uh, wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity, and examined the anthropological dynamics of religion, not just Christianity, religion, period, and put religious doctrine, religious dogma in the context of a social, economic, political, cultural setting so that he better understand why is there a proclivity to religion. Now, the fact is that religion is intrinsic in human beings because archaeologists have discovered caves in a number of countries, from Africa to France, by the way, 10,000 years ago, long before civilization, and they discovered caves where there are religious depictions, anthropomorphic images, in other words, a belief in some higher power. So this is very important to point out that there is a proclivity in human beings to obviously lean in that direction heavily. Now, Kant just happened to live in the age of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, heavily influenced already by the century before that, the age of science, when there were enormous revolutionary um, discoveries, not just of Copernicus, whom, by the way, Kant was heavily influenced by Copernicus, but Isaac Newton, Galileo. So you have huge impact. And when Isaac Newton comes along and says, by the way, the universe operates on laws all on its own, um, and proves it. So you have to then, if you're a philosopher, you have to take that into account. Philosophers, by the way, do follow science. They're not going to go against science. They're not going to go against scientific discovery. And Kant is a very good example of that. Although he was a Lutheran, he was religious, he was a moral deist, he would not deny science either. And he was highly intelligent, and he knew that the attempt of René Descartes to prove through reason the existence of God um, through the method of doubt, the Cartesian doubt, it's called, and finally wind up, first denying the existence. I'm here in my room. Maybe this room is an illusion. Maybe what I'm seeing across there, the mountain, that's an illusion. Uh, Denying everything. And then René Descartes was left with one thing, reduced to one thing. the fact that he was doubting. So he concluded, I think, therefore I am. And then he begins to reconstruct reality leading back to God, the rationalism aspect of trying to prove the existence of God. Except for one thing, rocks. I'm not going to talk about trees or anything like that, or animals like a horse or rocks exist. They don't think. So the I think therefore I am, does that mean that something that doesn't think doesn't exist? The ocean just down the street from me here, it exists but doesn't think. Kant was smart enough to not to go into that trap. Now he was also, by the way, Assad, I want to make another point, then I'll pause here. He was also by the period, because we're all products of our age. If he lived in the 11th century, he would not have written this book, Critique of Pure Reason, or what is it? He would not have written. He would not have thought in this stuff. If he lived in the 11th century, he would have more or less been either an Augustinian or an Aristotelian. He would have been like Thomas Aquinas, the famous Catholic philosopher or theologian, and would have thought, or if he lived, I'll give you another example, if he lived in the interwar period, like Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher who followed, the Nazis and defended all the brilliant existentialist philosopher, but nevertheless, unfortunately followed the Nazis. He would not have thought in the way, if he lived after the war, if he lived in the 1960s, he would not have thought. He was a product, as all human beings are, of his era. And he, in the essay you mentioned, what is Enlightenment? When I first read it, I thought, oh my God, this is good stuff. This is stuff I can use when I start teaching. And I did, by the way. And students actually related to that. They did not relate at all to the Critique of Pure Reason. But that was totally alien to them. But they they understood much more what is enlightenment. And he was, because it was easy, he was basically saying, think for yourself, stand on your 2 feet, have the courage to be critical, to have critical thinking, and it fits in with the age of individualism of our own century, by the way. And one reason that Kant became, so many thinkers have written about him, and Hannah Arendt has written about it. There's so many, it's just unbelievable how many. But he became popular again. I studied him in the 1970s. He became popular actually in the 1980s. With the advent of neoliberalism, he becomes popular again because he stresses individualism so much rather than the collective. But he was critical of the age of superstition when he was saying, think for yourself and be critical. He was, and one of the reasons that people, by the way, doubt, and there's been literature, there are people who maybe he was a deist, maybe, there's strong evidence, or he didn't even believe in God. And one reason is because he was cautioning people not to associate religion and with superstition. He was in fact arguing that superstition holds people back as individuals as well as society. So now, why would he say that? Well, in the 17th century, in the age of science, ironically, people who have studied the 17th century know this, it coincided with the witch trials. The Christians went after witches, especially women. There were some men. So you have this, and he was saying it's nonsense. You have to be reasonable. You have to have a rational approach to this. You know, yes, granted, there is a God.
Are you
Yeah,
talking
go
about
ahead.
the Puritans?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Are you
Go ahead.
talking about the
I'm pausing.
Puritans?
Say that again.
I'm asking, are you talking about the Puritans?
The Puritans in America, but also throughout Western Europe, there were holdovers from the Holy Inquisition, which was sanctioned by the Catholic Church, by the papacy in Rome. And one of the way that the papacy tried to retain institutional control and ideological dominance um, over the worldview of Western Christendom. This didn't exist in the Byzantine, on the Orthodox side. I shouldn't say Byzantine because that was over in the middle of the 15th century, and the Orthodox Eastern world. But in the West, there was great concern about the institution losing its hold. This is especially after the Black Death, you see it accelerating, and the belief in the irrational, I mean, superstition is the ultimate belief in the irrational, and Kant comes along and says, "What? This is nonsense. What is this?" Um, and a middle class person like him, um, representing the middle class, and of course having access to the king of Prussia and so forth. What else would he say? It makes perfect sense that he would. Now, he just because he said that, and he argued. He argued that the view, by the way, his view of religion, I want to make it very clear to everybody out there, was not the same as the common view of the average person in Prussia. I mean, um, his view of religion was not the same view as that of a Prussian peasant. He did not have that. I'm going to pause right here and ask you if you have any questions because I've talked too long. I see, my God. Oh my God, I've talked too long. Go ahead. Okay, your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yes, Mr. Kopus, as you know, what the title implies that we want to discuss how Immanuel Kant's Enlightenment affected the politics, society, and religion, as our title implies. So I have not, so far, I don't want to ask anything, like I don't have any specific question. We just have to proceed with the title, what the title implies. So we have to see
Okay.
how it impacted the world, and then after that we will discuss its after effects in the next centuries, and how the current world is being impacted by enlightenment. If there is any impact or influence of Immanuel Kant's enlightenment in today's world. So we have to discuss
Excellent.
these factors, and I don't have any question. I don't have any specific question. You can proceed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Hassan. Uh, yeah, you're absolutely right. The fact is, this is a man very close to Frederick the Great. There were two major enlightenment, two major enlightened despots. By the way, I want to explain what enlightened absolutism is, because in case people are probably thinking, "Well, I'm throwing out terms." And in the 18th century, with the impact of the scientific revolution, and the in the 18th century, and the rationalism, and the ongoing simultaneous industrial revolution in Russia under Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia, very powerful leader, who by the way wasn't Russian, she was German, as well as Frederick in Prussia. what you have is two monarchs who were absolute monarchs. In other words, they were above the law. They were not accountable to a legislative branch, accountable to no one. Absolutism meant that the king, the monarch, was accountable to God, not to the subjects. So this was called in European political tradition divine right to rule. They ruled by divine right, by being accountable to God, not to people. Obviously, this was questioned. John Locke questioned this, and then more and more people questioned this. One of Immanuel Kant's contemporaries, who obviously was far to the left of Immanuel Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote What is the Social Contract, strongly disagreed. He believed in popular democracy, that sovereignty rests with the people. Immanuel Kant supported enlightened absolutism or enlightened despotism. He supported Frederick in his own country, in Prussia. And he opposed, by the way, because he lived long enough, through I think he died in 1804. He lived through the revolution, the French Revolution, sorry. The French Revolution. The French Revolution, coming toward the end of the 18th century, was really the culmination of the Enlightenment. I mean, the Enlightenment was personified in the French Revolution. The ideas of Voltaire, a towering philosopher, a French philosopher of the 18th century, a centrist, profoundly influenced by Locke. Not that Kant didn't have liberal ideas as well. He too, by the way, was influenced by some liberal ideas, and we'll talk more about that. Since you mentioned, we'll stick to the title of the video. The fact is that he supported enlightened despotism, which meant that these enlightened despots, both up in Russia and in Prussia, believed that they should have policies that take into account not just the nobility and not just the clergy, but the rest of the population, considering that society was changing. So they were responding, meaning the industrial economy was changing the social structure, and there was a rise of the middle class. And Kant was well aware of that, by the way, and figured that, yes, the political system should address that. But he did not believe that, like Locke or Rousseau, that sovereignty emanates from the people. He believed in in more of the Thomas Hobbes, a 17th and mid-17th century political philosopher in England, who argued that sovereignty rests with the ruler, not the rule, not the people. So he had a different view. So when the French Revolution broke out, he was against it. He also criticized King Louis XVI in France, who abdicated. He was eventually executed, by the way, by the revolutionaries. So he was not in favor of revolutionary change or democratic change. He was a conservative. One of the reasons when I was an undergraduate in the early 70s, and when I first read Critique of Pure Reason and some of his other works, and I thought, oh my God, this guy is really conservative. I mean, 1970s was a period of counterculture in the United States, and rights for minorities and so forth. And so Kant was just not fitting in. He was revived in the 1980s when Reagan came, and Reagan in the U.S. and Thatcher, Kant becomes important again. In any case, Kant was in fact a political conservative. He supported, he was status quo. And even his moral theism, his political philosophy, um, in his political as well as his ethics, is designed to preserve the status quo. He believed in preserving the status quo, not getting rid of it, as did the French revolutionaries, inspired by his contemporary, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we're dealing here with a political conservative. However, having said that, I want to stress that he was a very intelligent man who knew something that an Italian, and I forget his name, an Italian thinker in the 19th century said when I think it was during the unification, the period of the Italian unification, who said that we must change in order to stay the same, which sounds paradoxical, change in order to stay the same. He was intelligent enough to know that change was important, that change was taking place regardless of what he thought. All he had to do is look what was happening in England. The reason that his boss, that Frederick, was doing what he was doing is because he realized the economy has to move forward. If he were to stay in power, he had to change with the times. The same thing with Catherine up in Russia. So Kant was, and he wasn't proposing anything bad, but ultimately he wanted the good of human beings and the good of society. And here's where we get into, again, deconstructing this concept. Political thinkers or philosophers may want the same goal. I think, and there, by the way, there are works about uh, Immanuel Kant and Schopenhauer, who was a contemporary much younger, and I'll talk about him too, about Kant and Karl Marx, way to the left of, obviously. The goals, I want to make sure people understand, the goals may be the same. The means to get to the goals, however, is another issue. How do you get to the goals? And will those goals be delivered? Since I mentioned Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, I happened to study at the same time as I was studying Immanuel Kant. And Arthur Schopenhauer was also German, also a professor of philosophy, a contemporary of George Hegel, the brilliant German philosopher. In fact, they taught at the same school. And he was, Schopenhauer was influenced by Kant. But Schopenhauer argued that what we have here is a man whose morality is based on duty. Now, the entire world must, I know, I recognize, know that the Germans have a sense of duty, doing the right thing, and morally right thing. And duty is associated, particularly in Prussian culture, with the military, because duty implies military obedience. Schopenhauer, who was German, comes along and says, wait a minute, should morality be based on duty or compassion? So he disagreed with Immanuel Kant on that score. Okay. He also, the reason I even mentioned Schopenhauer is not necessarily to contrast him as a contemporary, because I could have mentioned Hegel, but I don't want to go into Hegel. I think that Schopenhauer made an enormous contribution because he was one of the earliest important philosophers who took into account Eastern philosophy and religions, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, but also Taoism and Chinese faiths and religions. and try to see the universal and common elements in religion across the world. I revisited Schopenhauer when I was taking a course on world religions, and the thinkers in the West who, from Schopenhauer to the present, we have tried to do this. So Schopenhauer's contribution was more on the aesthetics. Now, Schopenhauer argued that the most important trait in human beings, and here's another fundamental difference between Schopenhauer and Kant, is the creative aspect, and that's at the aesthetic level, not at the ethical level. And that's another difference. Now, Schopenhauer, like Kant, however, was not interested in social development and social justice issues. However, he too believed that human beings, that the ultimate goal is to enhance human happiness and the happiness of society. And he was even more sensitive, by the way, human suffering. By the way, I should mention, Schopenhauer came from a very wealthy family. His father was an international merchant, so he came from lots of money. But he was very sensitive to human suffering. And in fact, his thinking, he's often called the philosopher of pessimism, by the way, in Western philosophy. His thinking was pessimistic because he believed that the endeavors of human beings is not so much to achieve happiness, but to avoid suffering, to avoid pain and suffering. Very, diverging from Kant in that respect. However, like Kant, he was status quo. He didn't propose. He proposed solutions at the individual level, again influenced by Hinduism, right? Spiritual contemplation at the political level through political action. In the 19th century, Immanuel Kant remained influential as for two reasons. Immanuel Kant, I think, through history, has remained politically important, philosophically important, because he was right on the edge of supporting the status quo, combined with proposals for change, combined with the sense that human beings should conform to the status quo and should follow morality and individual self-development through a moral path, through the categorical imperative. And so he had enough influence from the liberal tradition. By the way, there's some scholars who argue that he was a libertarian. That's sort of a stretch. There are some libertarian aspects, and this is his appeal to neoliberals today. But he remained relevant because of that. And the fact is that he was the embodiment of the mainstream, the institutional mainstream. And this is the reason for his enduring influence in society. In the 20th century, Immanuel Kant remained relevant in the Cold War, became important in the Cold War, in the early Cold War, and then in the neoliberalism. That is important at the time when I was a student in college, which the young generation was challenging the status quo. And then in the neoliberalism, he becomes important again. And there are articles out there about how Kant is part of the philosophical foundation for the neoliberal status quo to justify the neoliberal worldview and neoliberal philosophy and institutional conformity to the neoliberal institutions, basically. Okay, should I stop there and ask if you have any questions?
Okay, Mr. Kofus, sir, I think that uh, do you think that Enlightenment had a role to play in the decline of the power of the church in the European society? For example, even to, that a church used to be the most powerful entity in the state, and it used to control all the affairs of the state. And even in our Muslim world, we could see that the mosque was a very powerful institution back in the time of our holy prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then even after his caliphs, during the time of his caliph. The mosque was the most important institution in an Islamic society. Similarly, church was an important institution in the Christian society. But today we can see that churches and mosques and all these religious institutions are just their role is restricted just to religious prayers and worship. They have no influence on state affairs, on economy, on the people. They no longer have that control over the people that it used to have back in the day. So does enlightenment have to do anything with it?
The Enlightenment era did influence the church as well. The Enlightenment era and its rationalism had an impact on the institution of the church. You are correct that the church um, in the modern society is relegated to the spiritual realm and to the realm of morality, personal morality. You're correct that it does not have sort of political reach that it had once, because in 17th century France, the upper clergy was well represented, for example, in the French court. By court, I mean the French monarchy, the upper clergy, the French Revolution, the revolutionaries in France went after two groups of people, the upper clergy and the aristocracy. That's the kind of influence those two groups of people had. In the Russian Revolution, in the 20th century, in the Bolshevik Revolution, which made atheism, by the way, official, the official status, the church was targeted. And the reason is historically, the church as an institution, I'm not talking about individual priests who obviously looked after the poor, they were humane and kind and so forth, but at the institution and the upper echelons of the institution were linked invariably to the state. Now, does the church have that kind of power? I recently there was a statement by the Vatican, by Pope Francis, and he condemned, he called for peace in Ukraine, which was not the first time that he had done that, but he condemned what's going on in Gaza with the genocide or war of Israel against the Palestinian people. He was largely ignored. So what is the but Israel
Mr.
ignores the
Kofas,
United States.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but war is between the armies, and you said that Israel is fighting against the people. I mean, what kind of war it is that there
No,
is no
it is
army on
not.
the
It's
other
not a
side?
war. I agree with you. It's not a war. I remember in a different discussion we have you and I have talked about this. This is not a
Yes, it is not a
war.
war. War
This
is
is
between
just a
armies.
campaign against the people of. Uh, it's a conventional army with a naval force, an air force, an army, backed by the United States arms transfer and Germany, UK, and France, providing all of that power against civilians. It's not a conventional war. Absolutely. No one. And you can have someone, if people are prejudiced on this planet, you can have an extraterrestrial being, someone from another planet coming down and looking at the situation totally objectively from a different planet, and they would reach the same conclusion. This is not a conventional war. This is not two conventional armies, France against Great Britain, going at it in World War One. That's not what France against Germany, rather than Great Britain. Great Britain and France were allied. This is not a conventional war. This is just the Israeli army, supported by the West, bombing civilians and starving them simultaneously. That's what this is. Now, the Pope did come out against it, came out clearly against it, okay? Now, where is the influence of the institution today? It's in the followers that it has. It's in public opinion. And governments fear public opinion. Whether it's in Islam or in Hinduism, Modi, by the way, has used Hinduism for his political ends. Let's not forget, you can use, and governments have used, the church. That's what they use it for. Vladimir Putin uses the Orthodox Church of Russia. Institution because it has millions of followers, and that's the political base, the popular base of the political party. And if it's one party state of the one party state, so the church, even Fidel Castro, a number of years before he passed away, he was asked what was one of the worst mistakes you made as a revolutionary. He said, alienating the Catholic Church. They should have been on our side. We're with the people, they're with the people. So they recognize, governments recognize the influence that the church has as an institution, that religion has in influencing public views. So that is a very important thing. But since you mentioned the Enlightenment, and I do want to point out that in the Western world, the first intellectual who wrote that the Enlightenment era is over in terms of its impact in our civilization in the West was also German. His name was Oswald Spengler. And right at the end of the war, he wrote a book called The Decline of the West. And the decline of the West is really about, which applies today, by the way, as well. The decline of the West was really a critique of the Enlightenment, that the rationalism of the Enlightenment was for what? War, by the way, is the ultimate expression of the human irrational proclivities. It's destruction. It's mass destruction. That's what war is. Killing people and destroying things, property. The Enlightenment, and I'll link this to Kant, by the way. The Enlightenment was supposed to rationally solve such issues so people don't get into this. Kant, I should tell you, by the way, had come up with an idea of international peace. And since I mentioned Oswald Spengler, the German thinker of the early 20th century in World War I, Kant influenced the Paris Peace Conference and the thinking of President Wilson, whose advisors came up with the idea of a League of Nations, which continues in the United Nations. Can't believe in international peace. Governments should strive toward ending wars, because this is part of Enlightenment thinking, that human beings, rational people, solve conflict through diplomacy, through political means. They don't butcher children in Gaza. That's immoral, according to Kant. That's one of the categorical imperatives. It's the height of immorality to be butchering children and to be bragging about it. There are Israeli officials who have actually bragged. Well, they're potential terrorists of the future. So let's get rid of them now while they're still babies. So you have, my phone, I'll ignore it. So you have basically an Enlightenment movement that's effectively finished in the with the outbreak of World War One. And one of the reasons for the rise of existentialism in the interwar period, Jean-Paul Sartre becomes important and Martha Heidegger, the two leading existentialist thinkers, is because the uh, they emphasize that the irrational prevails in human beings, and the proof is in the political developments of the early 20th century, you see. So the Enlightenment is effectively over. And then, one of the last Enlightenment stuck to his guns, Enlightenment rationalist thinkers, was Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, in his correspondence with Sigmund Freud, insisted, who was a socialist, Einstein, as I've mentioned before, was a socialist and a rationalist. He insisted that we have to stick with the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the scientific method. And Freud argued, no, human beings, Freud in psychology, human beings bend to the irrational. Their proclivities are to the irrational. The atomic bomb, the ultimate expression of irrationalism. So the Enlightenment is effectively over in the 20th century. However, having said that, the reality of constant progress in science and technology takes you right back to saying, well, are we ever free of the rationalism of the Enlightenment? Then you are struck by the fact that science and technology in the 20th century, including today in the 21st century, have been used for mass destruction, which is the ultimate manifestation of the irrational in human beings. So, and this is where we're at. This is where we're at, unfortunately. Okay. Any other observations? I don't know if yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Kofus. I just want to we just want to shed light on how our current world is being influenced by Kant's Enlightenment, today's world.
The Immanuel Kant placed enormous burden on the individual, and in that respect, I suppose Arthur Schopenhauer, coming from a different direction with heavy emphasis on the aesthetics instead of ethics, different perspective, influenced by Eastern philosophy, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. Okay, different approach. The heavy emphasis on the individual, rather than the approach that his contemporary Jean-Jacques Rousseau had, which is that the individual is an integral part of society, of a community. And if we are to solve problems, we have to do it collectively, because there is a collective impact on the welfare of society. Transcends the individual. And this is an important element here. And one of the reasons that neoliberals are attracted is because of his emphasis on the individual. Neoliberals put all emphasis on the individual. Margaret Thatcher may have mentioned this before at some other video session, but I might mention this before. In fact, Margaret Thatcher argued, she went along with um, the Austrian philosopher Friedrich Hayek, who the father of neoliberalism, that there is no society; it's just individuals. Not the society doesn't even exist. And Margaret Thatcher repeated that. By the way, she was influenced by him and Milton Friedman in Chicago, so she went along with that. Okay, as though society is just the ultimate manifestation of atomism, to use the ancient Greek word, like atomic units, one, and they're all separate, and there's no catalyst bringing them together as a whole, and there's no collective community responsibility here. This is the ultimate absurdity, and Kant has been used, by the way, his thinking. Said people have used when people started researching and reading what has been written about Kant, they'll be amazed at how thinkers contradict each other about where he stands, including some, going from one extreme to the other about Kant. But Kant has been used by some of these people who want to justify the age of individualism, atomism, which fits in with the neoliberal model today and the neoliberal political philosophy. And the reason is because it's a rejection of the welfare of the whole. And that is unfortunately and the responsibility of, and this is an important element in the Islamic faith, obviously, the responsibility of the whole toward those who are less fortunate. This is an important element here. He did not, maybe some of the late 19th century thinkers were right about Kant, but he did represent, after all, he was himself bourgeois, he was middle class professor. He did represent his own, as they say. We are what we are. We're produced we come out of an environment, and our thought, as I said, if you lived in the 11th century, you would have thought this way. You would have thought very differently. He would have been more in line with Thomas Aquinas, the Christian theologian, the towering Christian theologian, Aristotelian theologian. And if he lived in the interwar period, I don't know what he would have thought, like Martin Heidegger. Today, his political influence and his cultural influence and ideological influence resonates with the neoliberals. That's what they want. They want conformity. They want no social responsibility. They want the individual responsibility, all emphasis, all the burden is on the individual, and no collective solution. So, and that to me is absurd, because there are collective problems. What's happening right now in Ukraine and Gaza, these twin wars. One is genocide or campaign. What's happening in Gaza is genocide. The other is a conventional war. Those require collective solutions. Clearly, the Chinese have stated so. Put another proposal on the table. Lavrov in Moscow has said, let's look at the Chinese, let's broaden this out. And this goes into the heart of an aspect of Kant which neoliberals don't stress, which is international peace, world peace, through rational means, through diplomacy, so that we can have stability instead of perpetual instability. Okay, I think I I've exhausted the topic to the best of my ability. So
Okay, so Mr. Kofus, you believe that you have discussed all the things related to enlightenment? Okay.
yes,
Okay, well, I hope that people have got the answers to all the, the queries related to enlightenment, and I'm hopeful that people have received the response to enlightenment, have received, helpful and useful knowledge related to enlightenment, and uh, I just hope that we get to know how enlightenment has played an important part since the past, for the past 3 centuries, almost 3 centuries. In 1784, Immanuel Kant published the essay, the German essay, which was translated as "What is Enlightenment?" and it is still being discussed very widely in the intellectual circles today. And intellectuals think that our today's world is greatly influenced by enlightenment. So, ladies and gentlemen, please drop your comments in the comment section. If you want to ask any question, you can ask us, and you can also share your opinions on the discussion that Mr. John Kofus had on enlightenment. uh, I'm thankful to Mr. John Kofus for his precious time, and I'm thankful to all the viewers. Thank you for your time. Bye bye.